Dystopian classics you should consider reading based on what your favorite middle grade or young adult dystopian novel is. So I'm talking about dystopian novels this month, and one thing that I wanted to do is there are a lot of modern day dystopian novels written in the 21st century, particularly ones written for the young adult genre, but there are also a lot of older dystopian classics. And if you're someone like myself who originally got into it when the big young adult dystopian boom was happening right around the time of the Hunger Games movies starting, or if you're a teenager today who's getting into it through the young adult genre, then what I wanted to do is recommend to you which dystopian classics you might be interested in based on which young adult novels you enjoyed. So that's what this video is going to be. Dystopian classics you should consider reading based on what your favorite middle grade or young adult dystopian novel is. Obviously, I won't be able to do every dystopian novel out there because I haven't read every dystopian novel out there. The one that I wanted to start with was Divergent and Brave New World. They both are societies where people are divided into groups based on things that are pretty much outside their control. In the world of Divergent, they're given a choice, but they're supposed to only fit into one faction, so it's not really that much of a choice. And in Brave New World, it's basically rudimentary genetic engineering. It's things that were determined before they were born. In fact, spoiler alert for one of the later Divergent books, there's actually some genetic engineering going on there as well. They're both societies in which there's not really a lot of room for nonconformity, and yet despite that, most people fit in and most people are happy. There are very few exceptions in either one of the worlds to the idea that everyone is happy and everyone has their own place that they fit in and everybody is able to contribute in their own way to society. There are the factionless in Divergent, who they may have fit well into one of the factions, but they didn't make it through the initiation or for whatever reason they had to leave. And then there are the Divergent characters who fit into more than one faction or have qualities or aptitudes of more than one faction. In Brave New World, likewise, there are characters that don't quite fit or aren't quite satisfied with society as it exists. And so that's kind of a similarity that they have, although there's nothing quite like being divergent in Brave New World. But if the idea of the main character being one of the few that doesn't seem to fit in a society where everyone does, and where everyone is divided into groups based on qualities that are kind of inherent to them rather than decisions that they make, regardless of whether there is technically a choice, if that's something that appealed to you about Divergent, you might be interested in reading Brave New World. If you liked The Hunger Games, you might like Battle Royale. Battle Royale is not a book that I have personally read, but I have read enough about it to know that it is very similar to The Hunger Games, and in fact a lot of people have said that The Hunger Games is probably very derivative of Battle Royale. Much like The Hunger Games, it has teenagers that are put into a situation where they basically have to fight each other to the death, and it all takes place under the authority of a corrupt authoritarian government. So, very dystopian and very similar to The Hunger Games. That's the only one on this list that I haven't read, but just because I know that it is so very similar to The Hunger Games, I feel pretty confident recommending it regardless. The third one on my list, this is actually an older young adult dystopian novel. This was one of the first ones that I read when I was first getting into them. It's called Uglies by Scott Westerfeld. And basically it takes place in a society where at the age of 16, I'm pretty sure it was 16, you get this operation that makes you pretty. It's basically plastic surgery, but there's a twist as to what the operation does that I'm not going to spoil in case you go read it. In any case, this is a society in which people have very superficial kind of ideas about how life should be lived. And no one thinks too seriously, and no one takes life too seriously, and everything is just kind of laid out for you as far as like the path that you're going to follow, and you're just kind of there to enjoy yourself. And that makes me think so much of Fahrenheit 451. In the Uglies trilogy, I don't remember anything about books being banned or anything like that, but regardless, despite the book banning thing being kind of central to Fahrenheit 451, it's also about a society where people are just kind of mindless and consumed by mindless entertainment that doesn't take any real thought to understand. And anyone who thinks too deeply or seriously is viewed with suspicion. It's not just books that are banned, it's intellectual thought. And that reminded me so much of the Uglies series. A dystopia where you're able to pursue frivolous enjoyment to your heart's content, but it's all kind of superficial and meaningless. The fourth one on my list is Matched by Ali Kandi. Matched takes place in a society where everything is very perfect at first glance, but when you start to dig deeper, you find some really disturbing things. And that reminds me so much of The Giver by Lois Lowry. It's kind of pushing it a little bit, I think, to call The Giver a classic because it was written in the very late 20th century. It was published in the 1990s. But I think it is generally considered kind of a modern classic. A lot of people read it in school, and it's much older than a lot of these books that I'm talking about as far as modern young adult stories. So I think I am going to count it as a classic, and it's one that if you liked Matched, you would love The Giver. Because they're basically the same society, except the Matched society is from the point of view of a teenager. Now, I don't mean that literally, they're not literally the same society, but basically the way that the community in The Giver works, where people have this superficially perfect lifestyle, but everything is decided for them, there is no freedom of choice, and there are a lot of kind of dark secrets underlying the perfection that the main character only discovers later on. That is so similar to the world of Matched. Even some of the specific things that are predetermined for you, like, for instance, what your career is going to be or who you're going to marry. If that kind of superficially perfect but no real choices in life kind of society was something that you found interesting to read about, I would highly recommend checking out The Giver. The next recommendation that I want to make is if you liked Delirium by Lauren Oliver, I would highly recommend reading 1984. Delirium takes place in a society where love is considered to be a disease, and when you turn, I think it was either 16 or 18, you get a cure for it. They basically do an operation on your brain to make you incapable of love, and that's considered to be like a good thing by these people. But the main character, of course, being a teenage girl in a young adult dystopian novel, she falls in love, and that changes her entire perspective on everything. The reason that I say that you should read 1984 is because, in a very similar way, in 1984, love is viewed with mistrust and suspicion, and people aren't really supposed to love their spouses or their children or their friends. You're not really meant to have an emotional connection with other human beings in the world of 1984. So even though there's not an operation for it the way that there is in Delirium, it's kind of a similar setup in a way. And likewise in 1984, the main character falling in love is one of the things that leads them to question the way that their society is. They both also are settings where there's a lot of surveillance. In the world of Delirium, everybody knows that, for instance, their telephone calls or their internet usage could be monitored. And in the world of 1984, your telescreen is watching you. So, when you sit down to watch the TV, it watches you back. It's a very similar kind of setup, although I will say that the world of Delirium is a lot softer than the world of 1984, and you're more likely to have a comfortable life there. 1984 is pretty bleak no matter who you are, whereas the world of Delirium, if you don't mind being made physically incapable of love, there are people whose lives are pretty superficially okay in that world. As far as 1984 being one of the bleakest dystopias I've encountered, if you liked Among the Hidden, I would recommend reading 1984. I say that because Among the Hidden is a very bleak dystopia, particularly for a middle grade series. It takes place in a world where only 2 children are allowed and third children are forbidden, and actually being a third child is punishable by death. So it's something that's taken very, very seriously in that setting. And the main characters, of course, are illegal third children fighting for their right to exist. But the government in the Shadow Children series reminds me so much of the one in 1984, and the way that it tries to convince people that it can be watching them through their computers and TVs and so on, in a very similar way to what the party in 1984 actually can do. It's the whole Big Brother is watching you thing, but without Big Brother actually watching you, at least not to the extent that they say they can. They also both take place in societies where there's not enough of anything to go around, and only a small percentage have access to either luxuries or things that they consider luxuries that we really wouldn't, like potato chips, for instance. So because of those similarities between them, just the bleak societies where there's not enough of anything and it's not really good for anybody, and the either surveillance or perceived surveillance, the impression of surveillance, I think that if you liked the Shadow Children series, you might want to try reading 1984. If you first got into the dystopian genre via young adult novels like Divergent and The Hunger Games, I would love to know if you've gone back to read any of the classics, and if so, which ones did you like the best, and how did they compare to the young adult novels that you read? Feel free to leave a comment down below.